Welcome to the Filmlinks Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 65, Lengthy Lean.
Yeah, and it's gonna be a heavy content episode. Maybe not a super long episode, but there's a lot to get through today because there's a lot to talk about with David Lean because there's a lot going on in his films. There's just a lot.
Yeah, probably the longest runtime for movies since we did like anything in India. And that's saying a lot coming from just like a normal British director.
Right.
These movies are hefty. They are long and they have a lot packed into them. They're not just long for the sake of it. They actually get to a lot of themes and a lot of really great character development and story development that I'm excited to get into today.
Yeah. They're not 3-hour long movies because they're inefficient. There's just big stories, epic stories, to put it more accurately. Before we get into the films he made, let's talk about the life and career of David Lean a little bit. He's British, one of the only, actually, I think still the only British director to win more than one Oscar at the Academy Awards. And I always love looking up the origin stories of famous directors and famous people in the industry, seeing what their first job was. And David Lean was one of those kids who was doing something else. I don't even know. But he was really bored by it. He'd spend every night. It's
interesting because in the Conversations with Great Movie Makers, he talks a little bit about how he grew up in a Quaker family and his dad would never let him go see movies. He really did not want him to see movies at all. And it was only later whenever his dad wasn't around anymore. I don't remember exactly why he moved out or his father died or something. And then he was encouraged to go see movies. But before that, his one of the ladies that worked at the I guess his flat or whatever place he was living at would kind of act out Charlie Chaplin movies for him, and would just kind of like reenact movies that she had seen. And so that gave him that bug even before he had even seen any movies before.
Yeah, right. Anyway, it came to a point where he was sneaking off every night or going every night to see the movies after he got off work. And eventually it got to the point where his aunt told him to just do something he loved. And so he quit his job and went to Gaumont Studios in Britain and became a tea boy, which is the most British position I've ever heard of. And I'm so happy that I found out that it's a thing, or what at least was a thing. It's probably just called crafty now. But yeah, the person who delivers tea on set, that's how big of a deal that was in Britain. And I love that was a thing. I mean, we've all heard the stories about how British unions require a tea break once a day where all production stops down, and we've all heard the stories about American directors going over there and just being very confused when suddenly everything stops in the mid-afternoon and they're like, what's going on? It's like, it's time for tea. And it's just
obviously
odd. Anyway, I love it. So eventually he would go on to be promoted to a clapper boy, what we would now call a second assistant camera person. And eventually he would become an editor, and that's kind of where he really got his creative start. And you'd see he became famous for the editing in his films, and he would have many famous editors work with him, like Ann Coates, editor of Lawrence of Arabia. Anyway, he would go on to debut as a director, doing a series of films with the famous British playwright Noel Coward, culminating in Brief Encounter from 1945, which is really good, and I think still on Filmstruck right now, so go check that out. He did 2 Charles Dickens adaptations, Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, which are both pretty epic novels in their own right, even though both films ended up being under 2 hours.
Great Expectations being Alec Guinness's first film ever, I believe, really? Who's going to be very heavily featured in this episode.
Right. No, this is the honorary Alec Guinness episode. We are accepting submissions for best Alec Guinness title now. Tweet us. No one ever tweets us, but I love to say it anyway. Anyway, I like pointing this out because it kind of shows that he has an interest in these epic, complex stories that kind of circle back on themselves. even though he isn't quite to the large format that he comes to later.
Yeah, one of the great things about Charles Dickens that bleeds over into David Lean's work is that Charles Dickens was so good at writing stories with a big, huge social backdrop, but they were always very personal and very character-driven, which is exactly what we're going to see throughout Lean's work, even after he gets out of doing book adaptations.
Exactly. And eventually he would make his first international co-production where studios are coordinating across countries and continents, and Hollywood starts getting involved in his career for the first time. And I have to mention this movie, Summertime from 1955, because it stars Katharine Hepburn. Oh, Katharine, I love you. Anyway, and his co-productions would eventually lead him to work with Sam Spiegel at in Hollywood, and that would lead to his run of epic movies in the 50s and 60s, which is really going to be the meat of today's episode. But eventually in 1970, he would make a film called Ryan's Daughter in Ireland, and it would flop compared to the rest of his films. And that kind of shook up his career to the point where he didn't make another movie for 14 years. He tried to get some stuff off the ground, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that today. But none of it would come to fruition. Eventually, he would make another film that was fantastic, had great reviews, A Passage to India in 1984. Wonderful that he came back. Sad that that would be his last film. His time was up as a person, I guess. I was going to say director, but really, the point is he died. I can't believe I danced around it that much. Now this got really morbid. Anyway, that's the story of David Lean's career in a nutshell. So what films in specific are we going to talk about today, Jonathan? And try not to dry your mouth out listing all of the Oscars they won.
Yeah, I think this episode has won more Oscars than the episode that we did specifically about Oscar.
Oh, hands
movies.
down. Hands down. I mean, we have two films this week that won 7 Oscars and one that won 5. So that's 19 Oscars per episode. Yeah. We don't have stats on that, but you'd be hard-pressed to find something that won more than an episode with more than 19 Oscar wins in it.
Yeah, from one guy, too. So we're starting with The Bridge on the River Kwai from 1957, which won, here we go, Best Picture, Best Leading Actor, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Editing, and Best Score, based on Le Pont de la Rivière Kwai by Pierre Boulle. I'm just going to assume that I pronounced all that right. I took 1 semester of French. Thank you very much. And then
Jonathan, did you know you can take free learning languages courses online at Duolingo? Not a sponsor of this podcast.
But tweet us if you're interested.
I take French lessons there, and I can tell you that I have no idea whether you said that right.
Thank you. That is a terrible advertisement, but still.
Well, hey, they're not paying us, so maybe we do better if they paid us.
Yeah, right.
Our next film today is Lawrence of Arabia from 1962, the movie everybody knows about, even if you haven't seen it. It won Best Picture, Best Director, Best Color Cinematography, Best Color Set Decoration, Best Sound, Best Editing, and Best Original Score. And this one, not based off of a book, but based on real-life events, the life of a man named T.E. Lawrence, who was a famous, officially a diplomat. From what I've gleaned, we didn't do too much research into his background. We didn't want to spoil the plot of the movie by comparing it to reality. That was the biopic episode. Go watch that. But he essentially did what Lawrence did in the movie, but to a less dramatized extent, I would say. Probably the plot points didn't come in such perfect timing as they do in the movie when they happened in real life. But it is based on a real-ish story, which makes it just as exciting to watch and explore and imagine how it happened in real life.
Yeah, and then we move on to Doctor Zhivago from 1965, winner of Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Color Cinematography, Best Color Set Decoration, Best Color Costume Design, and Best Original Score, based on the novel of the same name by Boris Pasternak. which was actually banned in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. They wanted to shoot this in Russia, but Russia was like, no.
No, we don't. We don't.
No
like
way,
that.
no way. So they shot it in Spain instead, which apparently you can make look enough like Russia to Western audiences. So
yeah, and if you can't tell from the titles, we're almost being more adventurous than we have since our world tour, because we are going from all over the map on this episode. Everyone is in a completely different culture. And it's so interesting to see how David Lean tackles all of these things. Just
David
in
Lean
his
was,
one.
David Lean was very much a globetrotter, and it's part of what makes his film so exciting. And we'll dive into that today when it comes to specific moments and specific films. But that's all we have for now for the setup. Let's dive into the films, then the meat of it.
All right, so we say this a lot, but since these movies are so long, I'm going to try and keep these summaries really short so that we can get on with it. So in summary, The Bridge on the River Kwai is about this group of British soldiers in World War II who are captured by the Japanese, and they are taken to basically a prison camp where they are going to be building a bridge for the Japanese for their transportation of stuff between their army, which obviously is a conflict of interest. The British are having to build these, but Alec Guinness's character, who is the commanding officer of this troop, has this this real clash with the head of the prison, and it's really interesting to watch because they're captured soldiers. He's so set on Colonel Saito, who is the head of this prison camp, following the Geneva Convention and not forcing the British officers to work, and only putting them in administration roles and all of this stuff, that he has this whole showdown in a situation that you'd not think would happen, and then he slight spoiler, he ends up winning that first battle of not having the officers work because Saito is so under the gun to get this bridge built, and nothing is getting done while the officers are all being locked up. And so once the officers are released, they use this bridge building as a way to get their men's morale back after being captured. And so they end up making this really nice bridge, but there's this whole internal conflict that Alec Guinness has to go through between pride in this work that he's done, and also the fact that this work that he's doing is for the enemy army, and should he be doing it, or should he be sabotaging it along the way, and all this kind of stuff. And it's just a really interesting journey to watch this power play and this pride battle in Alec Guinness's character between his patriotic loyalty and his loyalty to his men and what they've built, regardless of the circumstances.
Yeah, and it's a very complex story. Like, there's a lot going on beyond just Alec Guinness's character, although that is very fleshed out. And each plot thread that happens in the film is related to one another. They take the time to flesh out that Saito is under pressure to finish this bridge on time, and if he doesn't, then he has to commit seppuku? Harikiri? Is it the same thing?
Yeah.
I don't know. Anyway, ritual suicide.
Harakiri. They never say specifically, but he says, I'll have to kill myself if I don't get this done.
I bet they're both ritual suicides, but they're like slightly different types of ritual suicides. Anyway, not the point. The point is he's got a ticking clock that his life literally hangs on. And so, you get this interesting character arc for him that feels...
Yeah, because he's not a caricature of this bad antagonist that's just out to hurt everyone and just be this drill sergeant. Like, there's a lot of complexity to him.
Everybody's got problems in this movie. Everybody's got problems.
when he releases the officers and they all come out and all the men are cheering for them, you see Saito go back into his hut and just break down crying. that is not something you ordinarily see of the antagonist, especially of like a World War II antagonist, who is like just the easiest kind of antagonist to demonize and just make them very flat. But Saito is such a rich character. Like, you still don't like him, but you understand him a lot.
Yeah. And then mixed in on top of this is like this freaking background spy movie going on with this American soldier who's pretending to be an officer to get out of work, and then escapes the camp, and then gets saved by these these Siamese villagers, and then gets convalesces in a hospital, gets transferred over to the British Army, and then the British Army's like, you gotta do this mission for us. You gotta go blow up that bridge. Yep, they do. And this is this entire story bouncing over all of these locations that could have been a movie in its own right. And
it literally like becomes like a James Bond thing at some point when he's laying on the beach and the other female officer is there with him, and it's like, wow, okay.
Yeah, no, it is a rich, flushed out world that where all these different storylines happen and are complex and interwoven. And I should also say, this is the only one of the 3 films that we're going to talk about today that's under 3 hours, and it's almost 3 hours. And so when we say that David Lean is lengthy, like he's got these long movies, but they're just jam packed with stuff, and it's impressive how well connected this movie is in terms of themes, in terms of characters, plots, like mattering to one another. Everything that happens on the screen, regardless of how irrelevant it might seem at the moment, ends up mattering in the end to each of the storylines, and this wonderful complex net. And it reminds me a lot of Game of Thrones, just in the terms of the complexity and scope that's going to happen. And that's because both are epics. So when we talk about the epic genre of filmmaking, if you could really call it a genre, I don't know, maybe, we're talking about this jam-packed, wide-ranging stuff, something that takes the efficiency of scope concept that happens in most films, where you limit it to only certain characters and you let B-plots happen off screen entirely, and tosses it out the window to explore every nook and cranny that could possibly matter in this one world and put it up on screen. And it leads to fascinating, rich films that are wonderful to watch over and over again, because you feel like you're going all over the place in this film. You feel like you're experiencing so much in what is relatively a small amount of time.
And yet, this film is a World War II film, and there's so many World War II films, and it's easy to kind of get lost in the hugeness of World War II, but this film is so, it's so centered on this one event. You've got everything that matters to the building of this bridge is going on, and that's where all these complex and interwoven storylines come in, but it's not dealing with, everything World War II. We don't have this huge thing. World War II is kind of like this backdrop, but really we're focusing on these characters in this one prison camp, and very specifically Alec Guinness's character and Saito's character, and the American who goes off and has to come back and try and rescue them, and that's really interesting because it's that having a huge, very political backdrop, but not losing the characters and the heart, and just being able to dig into those, in this bigger world.
Yeah, and I should mention that this is, this is Lean's first really formal epic, I should say. Both of the stories for Great Expectations and Oliver Twist that he did before this were more or less epic stories in terms of just the sheer amount of time that's covered in the plot, if nothing else, and the number of characters involved.
Not to mention the pressure of covering Dickens.
Right, exactly. Dickens is an epic novel writer. That's a lot to cover, but this is the first time where he's really opening up and telling a movie making a movie on an epic scale. And it wasn't one that it wasn't like he was shoehorned as the epic guy at this point. He wasn't like we know him now as David Lean. Oh, he makes historical epics. That's what he does.
Right.
But he wasn't that at this point. In fact, there were a number of candidates up for this film, I think including Howard Hawks and John Ford, people, really solid filmmakers who are very good at what they do and could handle a film of this size that was angled at by the studios to be, hopefully, a huge financial and critical success, which it ended up being. But after the success of this film, Lean becomes the epic guy. He collaborates again with Sam Spiegel on a number of other films. He goes on to make, of course, Lawrence of Arabia, Doctor Zhivago, A Passage to India, and a couple other just giant movies that are incredible and epic, and that's how he becomes the epic guy. And of course, this, like many of his films, because they're epics, are shot on location. For the real epic nature of it, because all of his stuff is shot in like CinemaScope to get all of that wonderful, wonderful scenery that you're paying to fly these people out there for on film. But there's some interesting stories that go into the production of this film in particular. To start off with, Lean and Guinness didn't really like each other. They fought a whole lot. Guinness thought that, and a couple of the other British actors on the film thought that the book kind of portrayed the British in a very bad light, which isn't entirely wrong. The main British characters come off as very stereotypically British and not necessarily flattering, and maybe a lot of that has to do with the fact that this was written by a French person.
Yeah, but it kind of takes like some characteristics of British people and kind of brings it to a fault, like their pride and rigidity and rule following, and just like pushes it to the extreme. Like in a situation that anyone else would have just kind of caved and put rules aside and kind of tried to just adjust. It takes this general British sentiment and kind of hones it and brings it to the forefront and shows both the bad and the good of it in certain in this like extreme situation.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that is what happens over the course of the film. The pride that Alec Guinness's character takes in his work becomes a huge problem, to the point where it goes beyond just being pride in one's work to being anti-patriotic to a certain extent.
Yeah. And you get characters who kind of try to bring that up to him. And all the characters have really good points. Like the doctor guy is like, should we really like be trying to make a really good bridge? And then Alec Guinness's character is like, you know what? After the war's over, sure, maybe this will be used for the enemy and stuff for a little bit of time. But after the war is over, this is going to still be here and it can do a lot of good. And you're like, okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. So it's hard to really like side fully on any one character, because it's exploring all of these different elements to this morally ambiguous situation.
Yeah, of course. Everybody is a well-rounded character. Everybody has good points. It's just a matter of which points line up more with your ideals and your beliefs in that given situation, which is kind of the hard truth of arguing in this world. But anyway, so Lean and Guinness did not like each other. In fact, after one scene where Lean decided to shoot the entire scene from behind Guinness, not having any coverage of the reverse showing Guinness's face, Guinness got really mad at him, and then Lean essentially told him to F off, and I'm sick of English actors, and I'm so happy that I get to go work with a American actor now. So they fought a lot, but they also ended up having a really good creative partnership together.
Obviously, he's still like in his work 10 years later when we get to Doctor Zhivago.
Right. They recognize each other's talent, and they know that even if they don't get along, maybe they can push each other to make something better. And that's another kind of beneficial creative relationship that exists in this world, where you don't necessarily get along as friends, maybe, but because you know how to push each other and you understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, you can help each other achieve better work, which is a worthwhile a creative partnership, just like friendly ones are. Also, there's another story where in between takes, Lean went to cool off in the river. I don't think it was actually the River Kwai, but the stand-in for the River Kwai, and was swept away.
River stand-ins now hired.
River stand-ins, yes, that's a new profession. But Lean was swept away by the current and nearly drowned. So spoilers for this last little production tidbit from the bridge on the River Kwai. Seriously, this is the end of the movie, so if you care about not knowing, don't listen to this next bit. Skip ahead like 10 minutes and you'll be fine. Actually, make that like 5 minutes. It's not a long story. So at the end of the movie, the bridge gets blown up. And this is a really, building this bridge, even for the production, was expensive. And blowing it up was expensive. And they didn't want to do it a second time. So they covered it with like a billion different cameras to make sure they got it on film. Get it from every possible angle they could ever need so they wouldn't need it again. And they did that, and they got the film, which is great. But unfortunately, at the time, most film was shipped back to be processed in England via ship, because this is still the 50s. So we're going to send it by ship, right, from East Asia? Well, not so much, because the Suez Canal crisis is happening at the moment, and nobody's going through there. So you could ship it around Africa, which would take forever, or you could fly it in a plane, which they decided to go with, but it wasn't really standard at the time, so cargo planes weren't really up to snuff with this stuff. And when everybody arrived back in Britain, they were like, hey guys, where's that bridge film?
Oh.
Where'd it go? And so a worldwide search began for the bridge film. It was eventually located on a tarmac in Cairo, Egypt, just sitting there on the tarmac. It's been sitting there for a couple weeks now. And you would think, film being a chemical process sitting in these cans in that heat, it should have been ruined. But by some miracle, it wasn't. So they were able to get the bridge film back and successfully processed. But oh my gosh, could you imagine the conniption the producers would have had if that had been lost?
David Lean, just like...
Yeah, no,
just like,
no.
Oh my gosh, I can't, my career's over now.
Yeah, especially because this is his first epic film with these big producers. That would have been, like, if that film had actually been destroyed, we would not have Lawrence of Arabia as we have it now. We would not have Doctor Zhivago as we have it now. So whatever weird sciencey chemical physics process happened that protected that film on that tarmac for some reason, awesome. That worked great. We lucked out, and we still have David Lean as we have him now. But yeah, so that's the story of the Lost Bridge explosion film. And
so as long as we're talking about as long as we're talking about the very end, one thing I wanted to bring up, just as far as like editing and stuff like that, because David Lean in general had like pretty much complete control over his editing, but on Bridge on the River Kwai, there was actually some producers that went back and did a little bit of cutting on their own to it, and one of the parts was at the very end, where Alec Guinness realizes what he's done, and kind of has this moment of realization right before an explosion goes off right next to him, and he falls on the detonator for the bridge. And it's funny because before I watched this, preparing for this podcast, I thought that he had like fallen over and then he reached out and did it intentionally, as opposed to almost like an accident. And apparently David Lean had originally had his cut where he has that moment of realization and then he goes for the detonator but isn't able to, and then his body falls on it. That was then kind of cut into a little bit more of an ambiguous way where you're not totally sure if he meant to blow it up or if it was just it just happened to work out that way, because the producers were like, yeah, the more it's all about like mystical and ambiguous endings these days. We can't just like tell people what he was thinking. But I think that's interesting that I had always had it in my brain that he totally meant to blow up the bridge. And David Lean had a cut that was similar to that. But it can go a little bit different if when you just watch it as it is.
Yeah, and if nothing else, that shows us, the sheer importance of editing for little moments. How you can create and shape performances so much in the editing process. And of course, David Lean is pretty famous for being a fantastic editor. He got his start after he got his start as a T-boy, which is very important.
And there are some very famous edits.
And of course, he works with famous editor Ann Coates on Lawrence of Arabia. So just lots of great editing in this episode today. If you are interested in being an editor or want to improve your own editing skills, taking a look at David Lean's films is not a bad idea, especially because there's so much to look at.
Yeah. Specifically Lawrence of Arabia, which has some of the most famous editing in all of film history, which Alex is about to tell us about.
Yes, I am. Lawrence of Arabia from 1962. And quick summary, it's about a man named Lawrence in Arabia. All right, now let's analyze this film. Done. Okay, no, I'm kidding. I'll give you guys a little bit more than that. This is the first film that David Lean kind of used his bookending technique on. So we start in a flash forward in which we see a man crash his motorcycle, ending in a famous shot where goggles are hanging on a bush, I think? Is it a bush?
Yeah, some kind of shrub.
Bring me a shrubbery. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be taking a imaginary man's... Well, not imaginary. He was real. A real man's death so lightly. Anyway, so we start off with this death scene, and we've got these guys wondering we've got a reporter at this man's funeral wondering who this man was, who seemed relatively unimportant in England at the time, but had, correct me if I'm wrong here, Jonathan, but had some important people at his funeral. And so this reporter's wondering, what's up with this guy? What's this guy's deal? Let me do some research on him. And then immediately we cut back to just the story of Lawrence. It's not intercut with the story of the reporter like Citizen Kane is, but that is our intro to the story, which, if you think about it, is the intro that many people have to the story of Lawrence of Arabia before the film comes out. You might hear word of him, and then you go look him up and do research on him and discover that he has this amazing story going on in his life, in his past in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think people knew about him, especially in America, as we, find out throughout the story, that his story was very publicized in America to kind of galvanize people into the war cause for World War I. And he was known in like military circles in England, but there was still a lot of like mystery. Like people knew that he was like the guy who's like in Arabia and basically like living in the culture and not just being a British soldier in Arabia, but being an Arabian in Arabia almost, which is one of the kind of character dynamics that we see through within Lawrence's character himself. Yeah. But yeah, like I think the American reporter is at the funeral, and he's one of the ones that kind of says a snide comment about him, and then someone else is like, I take offense at that. He was a great man. And they're like, well, did you ever meet him? Like, no, but I shook his hand one time. And then we get to see that later on in the film, which is fun. So yeah, all these, we just get like little snippets of like, oh man, who is this guy? And why does he have such a big buzz about him? Seemingly contradictory buzz too. And then we find out why throughout the rest of the film.
Everybody's wondering why Lawrence of Arabia is a trending hashtag, essentially.
Right, exactly.
So we go back in time immediately to the story of Lawrence, and the rest of the story is told from Lawrence's perspective, not with narration or anything, but it's first person. There is no cut back to the reporter or any of that nonsense. So we see that he's kind of like this misfit in the British Army that's in the Middle East at the time. He is very, very smart, but also very, very insubordinate. He does not like... he's not very good at following orders to the letter. He doesn't respect authority as much as authority would like him to respect it. But he is very smart, and because of that, he is asked to be sent out to kind of be the liaison with this Arab tribe, this Arab. I'm not sure what his status is. Is he like a prince? Prince Faisal?
Oh yeah,
Faisal?
yeah, Prince Faisal.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Alec Guinness.
He seems to be kind of
He
like a leader of a lot, because there's the tribe dynamic, but Faisal
like,
seems to transcend that.
Yeah, he seems to be like a leader of a coalition of tribes, essentially. And he is rising in revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and of course this is World War II. So the Ottoman Empire, of course this is World War One. Sorry, we just did a World War II film like 10 seconds ago.
Yeah, it's confusing.
It's gonna be confusing, and we're about to do like a World War One and World War II film here in another minute.
Can you imagine if World War One and World War II hadn't happened? I mean, obviously there would be a lot of things that are better about the world, but also we would not have so much art that came after that.
Yeah, art comes out of conflict. It would just be different art, I think. I think there would still be plenty of conflict. It would just be different conflict.
It's just amazing how much, how much story we get out of those two wars. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I think film was the right maturity of a new medium at the time to document it so well, and to fascinate people so well with what was going on. Anyway, so Lawrence is sent out to make contact with this prince played by Alec Guinness, and to kind of like help essentially push him in the direction that the British want him to be pushed. But of course, Lawrence, being an insubordinate, isn't really going to do that. So he goes out and he goes on a series of adventures with the prince and his troops. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty detail of them because there's a lot. I mean, it's a long first part of the movie, but eventually he gains the respect. And a couple other significant things happen along the way. He saves a life and then has to take it later on. And he confesses at a certain point in the film that he enjoyed taking the life, and that he's disturbed by that fact. And that's something that would grow over the course of the film. And of course, the how you say the plot thickens through intermission as the war escalates, and Lawrence his progress with the
the intermission happens when Lawrence goes back to the British and tells them we've taken Aqaba, and then the British get on board with him and send him back with artillery. And then the second part of the film is a little bit different because it's not like Arabs fighting the Arab way; it's the Arabs fighting with the British backing.
Yeah. No, it's an escalation for sure. So now Lawrence has essentially his own army, more or less, of the Arab tribe, and he's going around just wreaking havoc on the Turkish troops.
We get the sense that his army is dwindling.
Yeah. He is destroying. He is destroying trains. He loses another friend who he quote shoots out of mercy to prevent him from being captured and tortured by the enemy. But of course, considering his earlier comment about how he enjoyed killing the one man, you have to wonder whether or not there might be something else in his motives there. And you see him over the course of the film get more and more into this culture that he's become a part of, and been immersed into in Arabia. And it's interesting because it's not necessarily saying that him immersing himself is a bad thing so much as it's showing that his cultural shift that he undergoes in this film is allowing him to unleash these inner demons that he probably already had in there to begin with, but just the identity shakeup that he has brings it out, and we get to see that effect on the people around him as the Arab revolt continues to actually be a success, as it would be in the end, I believe. I mean, obviously the Ottoman Empire fell, but we see Lawrence kind of lose himself over the course of the rest of the film, and eventually, clearly at the end, I'll just skip to this part because I don't want to spoil too much, but clearly at the end, he is sent back to Britain, and at that point, he's lost all of the importance that he's found in himself being part of this Arab community and being a leader among them, and being able to act as one of them, to the best of his understanding of what one of them is. Once he's lost that, you have to wonder, after he's put so much value into him being Lawrence of Arabia, can he really be Lawrence without the Arabia at the very end? Circle back to him crashing his motorcycle.
Yeah, which the film doesn't actually do, but...
No, but you do mentally. You're like, oh, right, that was the beginning of the film.
Yeah, they show him driving away, and then a motorcycle passes him, and you're like, oh, yeah. Oh, dang.
Yeah. And that was actually my first point, I think, for this film was I like the way that David Lean, and he does this again slightly differently in Doctor Zhivago, but he frames his story in this very interesting way in which he introduces a character in a very interesting moment and makes us wonder what is the significance of that character and that moment. What is the significance of this man dying? And you go back and you see all of it and you start to understand why, and you've totally forgotten the beginning by the time you get to the end until you reach the end. And then suddenly you remember the beginning and it circles back to you and it takes on a whole new significance that you didn't know was there before. Which I think is, in this case at least, is slightly more effective than leaving the motorcycle crash for the very end only.
Yeah. And that technique that Lean uses goes back to like Brief Encounter, in which he literally says that him and Noah Coward were writing this, and they basically lifted it straight from Citizen Kane, because it was probably about not too long after Citizen Kane was released, and they made this whole flashback thing, and then he uses it again in Lawrence of Arabia with just so much significance, and then again in Doctor Zhivago in a little bit different way in order to kind of guide the story. But yeah, Lawrence of Arabia, like, it sets up the themes that it's going to be dealing with, like, right from the beginning. Like, the first scene that we see Lawrence in, this whole he's got this whole match thing going on, and he lights a match and puts it out with his fingers, and then the other soldiers around him are like, man, doesn't that hurt? And he says, yes, but the trick is not minding that it hurts. And so we're setting up Lawrence's basically neurotic tolerance and ability to withstand pain in order to achieve what he wants. And that's something that we see over and over and over again as he goes into the desert and just immediately starts trying to live the way that they do. He doesn't drink until his guide drinks. And like you say, he settles a dispute by killing a man, even if it's someone that he already has this kind of this debt that this guy owes him, and now he's taking away his life after he's already saved it. But there's so many other themes, like fate and destiny and power, and there's just so many things going on. Politics versus the people who do like the policy making versus the people who are on the ground, like enforcing the policy, and where that disconnect comes in, and the kind of backstabbing and stuff that happens in politics. There's just so many things that go into this movie that you really couldn't tell it in under 3 hours and 47 minutes or whatever this film ended up being after a couple different cuts were released. And yet it's still done with so much style and so much just beauty is all over this movie.
Yeah, totally. And I think we have to point this out, and it stands out more in Lawrence of Arabia, more than it does in The Bridge on the River Kwai. I'm trying to say that as French as I possibly can, and I'm failing each and every time, but I will not stop trying. Anyway, the just wonderful performances of the actors and the excellent casting that is involved
Oh yeah,
in this
we get
film.
Omar
And
Sharif in this film as Ali, who becomes
Dr.
Lawrence's
Zhivago in Chicago.
basically. Yeah. But in this film, he's Lawrence's kind of confidant, and his character is fascinating because you almost hate him when you're introduced to him. He comes up and just like, without saying a word, shoots Lawrence's guide that's been taking him through the desert. And so they start like super standoffish, and then he becomes like one of the most central characters in the film and Lawrence's best friend in Arabia. And it's just a fascinating way that you can introduce a character and change an audience's perspective of them over time as you get to know them, which is kind of it's also a broader significant thing because Lawrence's first impressions and a lot of probably the British's just kind of initial impression of the Arabian people is, as they literally say in the movie, they're a little people, greedy, barbarous, and cruel, which we assume from the beginning when we see Ali shoot the guide over his well, that he's being, greedy and petty. And then as we get to know them and we get to know their culture, like our perception of them changes. And that's kind of the whole point of the movie, or one of the bigger points of the movie, is this shifting perception. And the more you get to know someone, the more that you sympathize with them and get to understand them. But it also takes that to the next level, to the point where you can lose your identity in someone if you start to identify them with them too much. And where is that line? Where do you cross this border into forgetting who you are because you're identifying with someone else too much?
Yeah. And of course, the rest of the cast is amazing, and this is like a theme in David Lean's work. He's just very good at A, picking people to work with who help him with this, and B, making sure that the best person for each role is in that role, or at least a very good person for that role, whoever ends up being the best person. Even going back to like Oliver Twist, like that is a well cast movie. If you get the chance to watch it, I recommend it. I think it's still on Filmstruck. Go check it out.
All the David Lean stuff is still on Filmstruck. Pretty much everything
a lot of it
he
is.
directed.
He was very recently like their director of the week or something. So a lot of his stuff.
And he doesn't have a huge director canon either. So
no, but I mean, maybe runtime wise he does.
Right, but not
because he
number of
spends
films
so much
wise.
time making one movie. But yeah, of course, the rest of the cast is wonderful. Alec Guinness is great in maybe a somewhat controversial casting role as Prince Faisal. And of course, Peter O'Toole is just brilliant as Lawrence of Arabia. He just has this weird magnetic charisma on the screen for this really complex, hard to understand character who just gets more complex as the movie goes on, and harder to understand, but at the same time you feel like you're empathizing with the changes he's going through over the course of the film. I also want to bring this up again. I think I talked a little bit about it with The Bridge, but these epic movies are a great example of world building. And of course, at the time, world building wasn't like a thing. You didn't call it world building. That's a more modern term. So really, David Lean was
it's a
world
thing
building.
people have done, but it's
right?
it's become a kind of terminology.
It's become a more recognized technique more recently. So really, David Lean was world building before world building was a thing. So he's a hipster, really. #hipster Lean.
Yeah, but it's interesting because we usually talk about that term in terms of fantasy and like literally building a world that doesn't exist. But here it's just it's a way to get us into a culture that we may have no exposure with, or you have to assume that your audience will have zero exposure to Arabian culture. So you have to introduce us to it in stages. Without being exposition-y, but we have Peter O'Toole, Lawrence, to kind of guide us through that because he's learning it as we are.
And I like to look at it as this. We always say that you can do whatever you want in a movie as long as it makes sense within the bounds of that movie, whatever rules, tone, world you've established. And there's you can look at that as a burden on the story that you have to go through all that work to make sure it's consistent, or you can look at it as an opportunity to enrich the story and really flesh out and make the world your characters live in be a living, breathing world that flows and moves around the characters and isn't dependent on the character's existence to matter. And that's something that David Lean does very, very well in his films. You feel like the rest of the world turns, whether or not the characters in it turn it at their will. But this plot is still moving forward because our protagonist is the protagonist who is instigating action to move forward, both acting and reacting to the world around them.
Yeah. And it's also amazing how much like politics is in this movie and how many like political schemes and stuff we have to kind of keep track of to some extent, because, you know, Lawrence is on one hand being used as a pawn by these politicians, but then trying to overcome that and put forth his own agenda. But it never gets boring. It's never like just talky and boring, because if you're paying attention, it drives everything that we're going to see, all the more like exciting things, where if you're just trying to get like an action movie out of it, you know, you have no reference for those moments if you don't pay attention to these other ones, and the performances drive them and the themes drive it to a point where you can sit there for 4 hours and not get bored with it, but just get more and more enthralled with it.
Yeah, and you know, this is technically a biopic, but I don't feel like it's traditionally thought of as a biopic so much as it's just thought of as a very good movie. I feel like it took the opportunity of a real life story to explore some really significant themes that went into that story more than it did a really significant character study. Even though Lawrence's character is a very complex character, I feel like the themes that went into the film were more important than how his character changed at the end of the film.
Yeah. And yeah, his character kind of is there to carry along these themes and to flesh them out, because there's so much just like inner turmoil that he goes through as he starts to lose himself into this culture, to the point where he makes the most brash narcissistic move by going into this Turk-occupied city just wearing the Arabian garb and assuming that no one will notice that he's a white British dude, because he feels so much part of the culture in himself, and he literally gets it beat out of him by the end of that scene. But it's fascinating to see him go back and forth, because then he goes back to the British and he's like, oh, I'm just going to be a normal dude. Please give me a normal job. Oh, I'm so glad we have a squash court now. And then he turns back around after kind of getting talked into it by some of the other army guys. And then he goes back out there and he changes a little bit, but there's just so much that goes into that character dynamic and that character arc, that it is one of the most impactful character arcs. But what you get out of it is an overarching theme. It's not limited to Lawrence. It's applicable cross-culturally. All right, so let's get into Doctor Zhivago from 1965. And it's based on a book again, and Russian literature is so rich and sweeping and in depth that you need a 3-hour movie in order to tell any kind of story from this culture. So we start off with Alec Guinness looking for his niece or a half niece, who is the daughter of his half brother and a woman named Laura. And we're shown this book of poems by his half-brother named Yuri, who's a famous Russian poet, but also a controversial Russian poet. We get told that he's been banned for a long time and maybe has been recently unbanned, and people can start actually reading him now. This is taking place in Russia, in the Soviet Union, during World War I. And so he's interviewing this girl who he's pretty sure is his niece that he's been looking for. And then we go into this flashback all about her father's life, Dr. Zhivago, who is orphaned as a young boy and taken in by this other family who has a young daughter named Tonya. And as they grow up, they end up falling in love and getting married. But there's also, we're also following the story of Laura, whose life kind of just in brief moments intertwines with Yuri. And the first time that they don't even meet, but the first time that they literally bump into each other is on this rail car. And as their shoulders hit each other, we cut to the top of the rail car grinding on the wire as it's stopping, and the sparks are flying, and it's just it's again another instance of that significant editing that David Lean is so known for. Literally, they bump shoulders and their sparks fly. And so if you're paying attention to these thematic things, you realize that, okay, there's going to be and also we've already been told that Yuri and Laura are going to have some kind of interaction together if we're looking for
somehow
their daughter.
They make a baby.
So, that is something that's really interesting about starting with a flashback like that, is that you're basically spoiling the movie before you're telling the movie. So the audience is already looking for these things. You're not trying to just like drop it on them.
If I could just go on a limb here, it's one of the reasons why I don't mind spoilers as much. I'm more interested to see how than I am where it's going to go. And maybe that's because I'm a film nerd who likes examining the how more than caring about the where. But I don't know, just throwing that out there. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, I think it depends on the movie. Some movies, you know, the ending scene is very significant if you don't know about it before you get there. But other movies, like, they will give you pieces of it, and then you get to fill in the rest as you watch the movie. And so there's just so many different ways of telling a story, and all can be impactful in different ways. But as we go along, Yuri and Tonya get married. Laura has this really basically tragic story of growing up as a teenager and being taken advantage of by this older, wealthy, more powerful man, and in public she's seen as this very kind of virtuous and innocent young girl, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes, and she has a fiance who at some point finds out and still marries her, but then kind of becomes corrupted. He's a fanatic.
Well, he starts off as just
Bolsheviks, right?
He starts off as just a liberal protester, but he is
peaceful
there's
protester.
a seminal moment, and again, this is Lean going out on a limb here to give everybody a very fleshed out plot. Because it's an epic movie, you can have these scenes rather than just hear about them through the other characters. We see Pasha get run down by these dragoons. This entire protest is being run down by the Tsar's cavalrymen, the dragoons, which are cavalrymen with pistols, if you didn't know. And broken up by them, and very significantly he picks up a gun, saves it, and that kind of starts the point of him going from being just a liberal reformer to being a full-blown, he's ready for revolution, he's a radical
militant activist.
And when the time comes later in the movie, he swings fully into that.
Yeah. So the story kind of continues, like this political upheaval drives the whole plot, and it displaces our characters and moves them along, and Doctor Zhivago ends up meeting up with Laura again later on during the war while he is tending to the wounded, and she has become a nurse in order to find her husband who has gone off to war and literally just ditched her. Like, he kind of throws himself into the war after finding out his wife's secret, even though they do have a child together, and Dr. Zhivago has a child with Tonya. But they get thrown together in this instance, and then they end up moving very close to each other later on, and so this love affair starts between them, and it's kept very secret, and we kind of see how this kind of illicit affair begins and then develops, and how this secret is kind of kept between them for as long as it is. And I don't remember what happens that he gets like kidnapped.
So he started the affair with Laura, and he's going to go break it off with her so that he can just live with his family. And then he gets stumbled upon by a bunch of Bolshevik partisans, and they are like, "You are our doctor now." So he spends 2 years with the Bolsheviks, and eventually he gets released. So he comes back to find that his family, his wife, his wife's father, and their child have been deported to Paris. So they're okay, but they're gone now. They're out of the picture. And Yuri and Laura start their relationship again.
And also we find out that Tonya found out about Laura because she went to go look for her husband, and everyone in the city. He kind of had this city and country life separated, but as soon as his wife goes into the city, everyone in the city kind of knows that there's this mistress, and so she finds out about it and leaves, and we don't really see her again, because when Zhivago gets released and comes back, he picks up his life with Laura, and they start living in the old hut where he was living with his family, to the point where Pasha, who was Laura's husband turned, again, violent rebel. As soon as he gets killed, they come looking for her as his wife, even though she wasn't with him any of the time that he had become this militant guy. And this really the super shady guy from the beginning, who had been taking advantage of Laura, comes and basically gives them an out. So it's a really complicated decision that Dr. Zhivago has to make in order to let her go with him, knowing what he knows about him. So there's just so much going on, so many character dynamics, and it's like these people have these relationships with each other, and then politics and war come in and kind of blow them up and blow them apart for a second, and then they kind of slowly drift together again, and then politics and war happen, and they get spread apart again, and then slowly come back together. And it's just fascinating to watch as David Lean goes through and elucidates all of these character dynamics with the stunning visuals and audio and everything that he does so well as a director to bring this movie into one cohesive whole. A very long whole, to be sure, but that's what he does. He makes it epic and he makes it beautiful, and you just can't take your eyes off of it.
Yeah, no, it's the perfect format for Lean to work in, this epic Russian storytelling. Very much War and Peace style. Not the same author, obviously, but it is a Russian tradition to have these very long, epic, complicated stories that go over generations, go over world events like that, and that's right up Lean's alley. And he just goes right into it, and it works very, very well. And the narrative framing comes back in this one like it didn't do in Lawrence of Arabia. And again, takes on a new significance at the end there, in a very interesting way that I don't want to tell you about because it's spoilers, but it's very good.
Yeah.
Oh, and it does involve a it does involve a balalaika, which is kind of like a Russian banjo guitar acoustic instrument type thing. Kind of. Yeah. Anyway, that kind of becomes this very interesting theme throughout the movie. I think this is fascinating. I don't know why this stuck out so much to me, but it did. That the balalaika works so well as a theme because it's both thematic in the sense that it's this gift that Yuri is born with, just like his personality that he's born with, that makes him this kind, nurturing person, even though he has flaws. It becomes a visual theme because we just see it everywhere all the time throughout the movie. And then, of course, it becomes an auditory theme, both when it's played in the movie and when it just becomes part of the score. So it's a very interesting choice that was probably made in the book, even though I haven't read it, that just transitioned perfectly into the format of film.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that stuck out to me about this movie is how much it also resembled some of the Russian filmmaking that we've seen. Like some of the ways that Lean would create these emotional resonant moments kind of reminded me of the slow and deliberate and symbolic moments that we saw in like Tarkovsky, for example. So there's a moment where Zhivago is looking out of this completely frost covered window, and we just slowly see these little frost tendrils dissipate and fade as the seasons change. It reminded me of the way that Tarkovsky kind of holds on even just the condensation of a glass on a table as it disappears, and just filling all of these little things with so much significance and meaning to the story, and how that reflects back on this really intimate character study that we're doing, again, in the midst of this huge political backdrop. But again, it's always taking backdrop to these really intimate character dynamics.
Yeah, and I love that the setting for this one's so different than the other two. I mean, over the course of just the films that we're watching today, just in terms of world building visually, you get the jungle, the desert, and the tundra, and it's strikingly beautiful, both how different each of them is from each other and how cohesive the visuals are for each film. The whites and the blues used in Doctor Zhivago are just gorgeous, and the frozen house at the end that's just like covered in icicles is just really, really pretty, guys.
I think he literally tells a story of how in that scene they wanted to remove all the color, so him and the set designer would go around with just cans of gray spray paint and spray paint anything with color just to make it this perfect, like icy, just crystalline perfect like scene that he was making. But it's striking. It's so striking.
Yeah, no, it's very, very good. And Zhivago is a very complicated character, just like Lawrence is. And I find in both films, like, you really want to like this person. They're so interesting. You're with them throughout the entire movie. You see them push the narrative forward. And yet they have these flaws that are just so hard to overlook. In Arabia, Lawrence is kind of like a psycho killer to a certain extent, or at least has psycho killer tendencies.
Yeah, that's only part of it. It's also just like his pride, and that's I think Ali even just says like your blasphemous pride. Like he's tempting God with all of the insane things that he does because he thinks that he's above it. Like he can do anything, and he has to be taken down a couple pegs. But yeah, you're right. Like you want to like him so much. He seems like the everyman at the beginning, and by the end, you're like, oh my gosh, he was so much more than that.
Yeah, he was something else entirely. And Doctor Zhivago is another character who is very, very proud, very sticks to his ideals, and they're very high ideals, and they're ones that you respect a lot, and you value him for valuing them. But at the same time, you see him follow those ideals to his detriment at times. In moments where you want to scream, just go, just take the out, just save yourself and have a good life. Why would you doom yourself like this? And in other moments where he just, is terrible to people around him, such as the main plot of the film being the fact that he's constantly cheating on his wife. Just over the course of the entire movie, and doing things to put them in a bad position because of his pride. Rather than swallowing it and making a sacrifice here or there to preserve him or his family's welfare.
And another part of that pride, plot. I think, is that he thinks he can have both worlds. He thinks that he can get away with both of them. Until it all comes crashing down around him. Yeah.
In a very dramatic, epic fashion. Speaking of epic, Jonathan, let's transition into overall notes for this podcast. Most of which and I'm sure this probably annoyed Jonathan, are just like something followed by of epic proportions.
Because Lean doesn't do anything small.
No, he doesn't do anything small. And part of it, and that's something that I wanted to point out, is that these are, we've talked, I think I've talked a lot about small films before in the sense of the scope, but this is the exact opposite. This is huge.
Yeah.
The length of the film is large. The scope of the story is large, both in the length of time presented and the number of characters covered in depth over the course of the film. Of course, the format is large. These are all like CinemaScope films. They're huge on screens.
But the intimacy is so personal. That's what's amazing, is that he's able to mix that.
Yeah, of course. And of course, I just threw it in there as a joke, but the Alec Guinness of epic proportions, because, well, let's face it, this is also the Alec Guinness episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, and you're totally right, Jonathan. Even with all this world building, it doesn't feel like the world building is there for the world building's sake. The world building is there to give you a context to understand the world these characters live in, because the world affects the characters. And so the characters, at the end of the day, still stay essential in these films and are the important driving force that moves the narrative forward, even though the world around them remains living and breathing and impacting on the characters.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, Lean would probably hate it if I brought this up, because he talks about how he doesn't like critics who try to find like a common theme throughout a director's entire work, which we do all the time. So I'm going to do it again here.
Oh yeah, we do it all the time.
Because one of the things that we see in all of these films is that these main characters, they're so complex, but kind of what's at the root of a lot of the conflict is a loss of identity in one way or another. So you see Alec Guinness's character in Bridge on the River Kwai kind of losing his identity as a British officer in his identity as just an officer of his men. And then in Lawrence of Arabia, Lawrence also loses his identity as a British officer in his identity with these Arabian people. And then in Doctor Zhivago, you have this loss of identity as a husband and father in his getting swept up in this love affair with Laura. And so it's really interesting that's just one of those things that kind of flows into all of these. And obviously, if you have movies that are dealing with characters going through so much change and personal inner conflict, I guess a certain loss of identity is at a root of a lot of personal conflict. So it's a little bit inevitable, but it's really interesting to see how David Lean is able to flesh that out in 3 different ways, in 3 completely different circumstances, just showing what a universal idea it is and how important these movies are to us as people trying to figure out our own identities in this world.
Exactly. And of course, I think we might have talked about this before in the podcast. I don't remember why we would have talked about this on the podcast, specifically this instance, but it's come up before. Mainly the role of Alec Guinness in Lawrence of Arabia as playing an Arab when he's not an Arab. And of course, that's problematic. And of course, Alec Guinness gives a wonderful performance in it regardless. Yeah. So I don't know, and it's one of those things where I think you're allowed to have a divided opinion on it. I think you can say that this is bad, and it comes from a systemic problem that is goes stretches far back, and we're just now starting to really unpack and try to correct moving forward. And you can also say that Alec Guinness's performance has value as just a really good performance, and you can think both things. You can value the performance for the acting talent that went into it and the directing talent that went into it, and you can admonish the people involved for the poor choices made. That being said, I think that's really all you can say about it.
Yeah, I
think about it what you will.
Yeah, we've seen two sides of this on the podcast before. We've seen Paul Newman in The Outrage, which was a long time ago, but he played a Hispanic character and did a really good job, and we loved it. I mean, Paul Newman is white, but he put everything he had into this character. And then we've also seen Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is using a white actor to stereotype an Asian character, and
It
that
was just
is
bad. Like, I'm not even
the
sure it was a
wrong
good
way to go
performance.
about it.
Like,
Yeah.
it was just, I mean, there were no positives about that at all. When there's
Yeah.
positives about it, there's something to be valued. When there's something to be valued of it, you should value that thing and, disvalue the rest. But when
Yeah.
in an instance like the Mickey Rooney thing, that's just bad. It's just 100% bad.
It's just
you don't need it.
Using punchlines based on race was just not a good way to go about it. But you have Alec Guinness just playing an Arabian character and playing him with a lot of nuance and gravitas. And he does a really good job. And the other thing is that David Lean doesn't systemically whitewash his movies. He has a ton of Arabian actors in Lawrence of Arabia and Japanese actors in Bridge on the River Kwai. And the other thing
Omar
that I think is
Sharif,
really,
an
I know, that's
Egyptian
what I was about to
actor,
bring
goes
up.
on to play a Russian character in Doctor Zhivago.
Yeah.
And I know it's not a tally sheet. It's not like a 1-for-1, but I think in both cases you can see that sometimes the performance given is more important than the other, than the social implications. And clearly that was the case in the 1960s. And maybe that's not the case now. Maybe we value the social implications more than we value having a specific actor in a specific spot. And that's not to say that you can't get a great performance and appeal to good social politics at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the differences nowadays is that there's more opportunity for people of other nationalities to become actors and to become the caliber of actor that is needed to play these really heavy-hitting roles like Alec Guinness's character. But in these instances, this is not an instance where no one can claim that David Lean is being racist or insensitive by casting these people. He was literally just choosing the best actor that he knows he has a working relationship with.
He was picking
to
the
play
person
these.
he knows. The producer, and maybe even more importantly, the producer at the studio, Sam Spiegel, was picking the actor that he knew would bring people to the box office,
Right.
which still happens today. The most recent example, and of course this is a slightly different example because the movie wasn't good, was Scarlett Johansson in Ghost in a Shell. The reason she was cast in that role was probably because people knew that they would go see a movie with ScarJo in it. But in that case, it didn't lead to a better movie necessarily. So it was a thing that happened. It's probably not a thing it's definitely, actually, I'm just going to say, it's definitely not a thing that needs to happen anymore. You can find the caliber of actor you need for the role you have of the nationality of that character. It's doable moving forward. But I think maybe more importantly, and this is something that I like to think about looking backwards. And of course, I'm looking at this from a pretty privileged standpoint. But just because there's negatives about a thing doesn't mean you can't take the positives about that thing and value it.
Yeah, don't throw the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. You can take the positives, learn from it, and apply it to your own things moving forward, not making the same mistakes that were made in the past.
Yeah, exactly. And then to wrap up, we should talk about just kind of the end of David Lean's career, because he was so dedicated to film. He was working up until he literally was physically unable to work anymore. And even at that point, he was still hoping to go on and make another film. He had pre-pro'd a film version of Joseph Conrad's Nostromo with a huge all-star cast. I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but he was planning to make that even while he was on his deathbed, too sick to get up and work. And that's dedication from this director who put so much of his life and his time into making these films, and just no holds barred, just putting everything he could into these. When you watch Lawrence of Arabia and you see these camps that span a mile that are not CG'd. They went out and built these huge...
the days before CG.
I know that, but it's so amazing to watch, and it just takes your breath away, for good reason. And he put so much of his work into it, and he did it, as long as he possibly could. And I think we got a lot of good and a whole lot of really important film out of David Lean's career.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think that's a good place to leave it for today, Jonathan.
All right, then let's talk about what we're going to be talking about next time on the podcast. And next time we are going to have another guest episode, and we are inviting back Benjamin Anguarzano to the podcast, and we will be talking about the early collaborations between Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro, specifically in the films of Mean Streets from 1973, one of Martin Scorsese's first directorial outings. And then we'll be talking about Taxi Driver from 1967, and finally Raging Bull from 1980.
Yep, it'll be great to talk about those three specific movies, Jonathan. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlinks.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Welcome.
Welcome. That's the new intro for this podcast. We're just going to make sounds like we're eating really good food. Oh yes, this is delicious.
I know when I put this podcast in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is insightful and deep.
Tastes like chicken.